The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, an extended conversation with Brian Levin, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. And Bill Press with Larry Sabato, founder and director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics and Sabato's Crystal Ball. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In the wake of the reported plot to kidnap Michigan Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, attention has turned to what we know about the threat of violent extremism in our current political climate. Before that news broke, we spoke with one of the most trusted voices on hate and extremism in America about the nature of that threat, the role of white supremacy, and why a major election creates a moment of even greater risk. And we say hello to Brian Levin, a criminal justice professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Brian Levin, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. By the way, we are nonpartisan, and we'll talk to any community or research group that has questions, but we're nonpartisan and we don't endorse candidates, but we do support certain laws and policies.
And that's a good lead-in to our conversation today, Brian. We're now hearing numerous warnings of politically driven violence heading into the election. These reports are coming from within the government, and they often identify white supremacists as the greatest threat. Can you give us a sense of how this threat could actually play out? I mean, are we talking about largely armed militias?
It's a broad threat that is approaching our nation. And I think one of the things that we do is we often look at it through a political lens. And oftentimes that's not necessarily the worst place to start. However, there are also changes that are occurring non-ideologically with respect to extremism. So let me try and untangle this a bit. We've been saying for some time, and the words have been echoed by the FBI and DHS in subsequent reports and hearings, that the white supremacist / far-right threat is the most prominent lethal threat facing the United States today. What I would say, though, it is not the only one. There are three types of people who engage in mass or symbolic violence. One are the ideologically motivated. Two are the psychologically dangerous. Three, personal benefit or revenge. And if you're thinking, hey, all three of them can be intertwined, you're absolutely right. So what we're seeing now, let me address it from the ideological perspective. We're seeing a prominence with regard to white supremacist far right. And last year, our data for 2019 showed that there were at least 29 white supremacist homicides in the United States, suspected white supremacist homicides in the United States. It's the third annual increase that the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism has found. And listen to this. Those 29 white supremacist far-right homicides were more than all extremist homicides by every ideological stripe done the year before. If you go back to 2016, we only had 3. And during that time, the alt-right and others were kind of dressing in their best khakis and going to demonstrations. So we saw a doubling in California, for instance, in that period of time of violent public demonstrations that ended at like third quarter 2017 over the previous 3 quarters the year before. So what I'm saying to you is activity on the fringes sometimes is more violent, sometimes more public, sometimes you can capture data by looking at certain terms online. But the bottom line is, I think in addition to the increases that we've seen in recent years, and I'll close up this particular question with this, has been that they have been jockeying into the mainstream. So sometimes groups can't make it in, but a certain type of coarseness, verbiage, conspiracism has. And I think that is critical here, because we have found in social media, as well as messages in the socio-political landscape, have created an elastic reservoir that has become a garden of conspiracism and fringe beliefs that then get in a fresh rush of new folks who can be radicalized, some of whom are fearful, but not necessarily extremist at the time. So bottom line is, what we have now is the traditional increase in conflict and hate crime that we see around election times. Worst month for hate crime this decade for hate crime, November 2016 election month, last presidential election. Day after election was the worst day for 13 years. The second worst was October 2018, right before the House flipped from red to blue. And we saw in both these periods, by the way, terror attacks or plots. We saw a plot in 2016 to blow up a predominantly Muslim apartment complex in Kansas. And then in 2018, we saw a Tree of Life and some other attacks. By the way, this is something that happens other places as well. We saw an increase in hate crime in Britain around Brexit and the assassination of a member of parliament. So we have this kind of stuff that's been happening in recent years around elections. But now we have an overlay of a pandemic, people who are under stress, psychiatric stress, people who are under economic stress. Gun sales have gone up significantly. So we have kind of this perfect storm. And then on top of those contemporary anxieties and traditions of conflict around elections, we have this new civil guard, vigilantism, QAnon, and Boogaloo Boys. And with that, there's an interesting twist, along with accelerationists, by the way, who are just looking for society to kind of burn down, and they want to cause it. And that is a timing around election time as an event-driven period, along with a diversification of folks who are considered legitimate targets for aggression. Prior years, we saw Muslims, we saw Latinos, we saw Jews. We're still seeing that, by the way. But what we're also seeing this is morph into a political hatred, so that, you know, Antifa, whatever that is, it seems to be conflated to everybody up to Joe Biden. And we're seeing public health officials, school officials. So we're seeing people who are engaged in both politics or some kind of public policy or public service being part of this new stereotyped and conspiracized set of enemies that are coming out in the hard right. And it's being fomented in many instances by this administration and some news media.
You know, you've been following hate groups and political extremists for a very long time, and I think you just answered my next question, which, you know, it's because there's the news cycle is just so rapid fire right now. It's kind of hard to figure out what's what, how much is has been there all along, or are we just recognizing it more? So we're seeing a real surge in this kind of activity, as opposed to perhaps just government acknowledging or the press covering it more.
You know, data can be your friend in both the hard and medical sciences, as well as the social sciences. And what I think is so remarkable is that when one looks at different data points, we're seeing confirmation. Let me give you another example, by the way. hate crimes are actually down first half of the year 2018 in most places outside of Los Angeles, and most groups other than anti-Asian, which has really gone up in many cities, including New York, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and other places. So you kind of see this interesting parallel tracks that point in a particular direction. What I would say, though, is that, when the Oklahoma City bomber took place, who we heard from again? The Unabomber. So what I'm saying to you is extremism doesn't occur in a hermetically sealed bag. It responds to advances by not only fellow travelers, but antagonists and certain kind of mutations that take place. And I think some of the biggest things that are not being covered, certainly the white supremacist is, but I think there are several tangential issues that have not been. The first has been, while centers like ours and others, but we've been very quick with getting the data out. The lethal threat has increased for the last several years. If that were air crashes or earthquakes, I think you'd see attention paid to it. So that's one thing. Also, how these groups organized. We were talking about 2016 when there was a brief quiescence, if you will, of the more lethal stuff. It's because they were on their best behavior while trying to enter the mainstream. Muslim bans, which were only before placed on the most extremist kind of groups like World Church the Creator or on Stormfront message boards, were now becoming quite popular in the mainstream. And what I think is important, and again, we don't endorse candidates, but it's really interesting. Anti-Muslim hate crimes, something like tripled, I think, around the San Bernardino terror attacks. 5 days later, when the Muslim ban proposal was trotted out in the morning on the internet, and then Twitter, and a campaign page, and then at a nationally televised conference that evening, we saw an immediate spike in the severity as well as the numbers of anti-Muslim hate crimes. Charlottesville, the big increase after Charlottesville was not the day after Charlottesville, but it was that Monday when the president made his very fine people statement. We saw hate crimes peak during that week at like 50% higher than the daily average. So there's this interesting interplay. And what we're concerned about is, as the new boogeyman is not like a person, or groups of people like Latinos and caravans, which helped motivate the Tree of Life attack because Jews were supposedly opening up the floodgates. But this messaging that we see, this data that shows up online, it gets repeated and it gets changed, whatever it is, and then it gets translated in some kind of aggression. Oftentimes, though, and I think the misconception is that a political leader, for instance, can really do this on their own. I think political leaders' rhetoric is most impactful when it comes around a highly charged event, terrorist attack, for instance, or even a pandemic. When President Trump briefly on March 23rd spoke tolerantly about Asian Americans and didn't use a national and ethnic-based term for COVID-19, we saw a brief pause in anti-Asian hate search. And we think the data is really preliminary. We're looking at day-by-day ticks as much as we can for anti-Asian hate crime. We think there might have been a brief pause there too, but then it went right back up again. So we're in a different environment now. And what's interesting about us is, unlike people who are looking out on the horizon and seeing clouds, we're actually kind of getting the meteorological data, and it doesn't look great. Just a couple last quick points. It also means that I think we're going to see a diversification with regard to extremism. A lot of people ask me, what about the left? One of the things that exists with regard to extremism is how big is that elastic pool of people that you can convert from the mainstream into your more violent cause. And I think today, particularly when we're looking at polls which indicate that the president is underperforming significantly, his supporters on the fringes, we've seen this at least in the past, may regard themselves being in a new, different type of milieu, more like an insurgency if the left and the Democrats come in. With regard to the hard left, the ability to make an insurgency has been most successful in the mainstream election campaign. In other words, people, for the most part, on the left, now there certainly are angry, and we're the most polarized that we've been in decades, and there certainly is fragmentation across all spectrums, including within ideological camps. The bottom line is, on the left, people are mobilized to vote. Mm-hmm. They're not mobilized so much to participate in a type of terrorism that is part of a hard right folklore. I'm not saying that people on the left aren't capable of committing extremist violence. We racked up our first hard left extremist homicide in years, maybe decades, just this year. But the bottom line is, extremism is diversifying, and we're concerned that the decline in trust in information and the communal institutions which hold us together, as well as the appearance of rapid change, while this is, the white supremacists and the far right in the pole position, it is one that in uncertain times can fragment.
I want to talk to you about, we witnessed bizarre, borderline scary moment during the first presidential debate, during which the president seemed to be encouraging the Proud Boys, a well-known hate group, with his words, "Stand back and stand by." First of all, tell us about the Proud Boys. And in one interview, in fact, you called them a sugar-coated version of skinheads.
They are of racist skinheads. And it's interesting because they're this platypus of a group. And I'll talk a little bit about them, but you know what? While there's a media scrum and researcher scrum around the Proud Boys, and certainly there should be, because now they've been elevated, I think what is often, again, missed, and I'll get to the Proud Boys in just one second, is the history of violence, a folkloric type of leaderless resistance violence, one that often involves street gangs. Look, going back to the 1930s here in the United States, we had the silver shirts. Many people haven't heard of those. They were t-shirted street thugs who were the analog and cousins of Hitler's street thug brown shirts, kind of these brown shirts, these enforcers. So we have this tradition of this leaderless resistance, or these groups. We don't have that on the other side of the aisle as much. But what I think is interesting with respect to the Proud Boys is they've been able to angle themselves into this weird limbo zone of quasi-acceptability. They're neo-fascists, okay? They wear t-shirts of dissidents being thrown out of helicopters a la Pinochet, who they love, the 70s totalitarian dictator from South America. They loathe Muslims. They were founded in 2016 by the nitwit Gavin McInnes, who wrote that wonderful, tolerant piece called 10 Things I Hate About Jews. So they're also anti-Semitic. They're misogynists. Another thing, boy, you could do a whole show, and there's some great people out there on the cutting edge of this research. Misogyny as kind of this glue, this machismo with these folks. So misogyny is big with the Proud Boys. They're xenophobic, and then they edge into the mainstream. How do they do it? Well, they say, hey, we have people of color in our group. Indeed, the current national leader is from South Florida, and he's Afro-Cuban. But they talk about Western chauvinism. This is along the spectrum, and in some places a wink and a nod code word for Euro nationalism, white nationalism. So you can join our group as long as you think that like Euro folks are better. Yeah, and that's something that's been within the white supremacy world for some time. During the 80s, there was a fellow, I don't want to give his name, but there was a debate about like, what about folks from Southern Europe who might have like Italian or Spanish type names? You know, how do they show their cred in the white supremacist and white nationalist world? Bottom line is Proud Boys. And let me tell you something, you know, I took pictures of these guys years ago. They were like so unimpressive. They looked like just weird. In other words, that's what struck me. When you go to a lot of these rallies and stuff, you know, certain groups strike you a certain way. Certain groups try to promote the idea that they're non-aggressors and they're professional. And other, you know, they just look like a ragtag bunch of Islamophobic, xenophobic fools. But they wear the Fred Perry shirts that the skinheads used to wear. I thought that was an interesting imaging. And what else? They were at Charlottesville, but they were also providing security for Roger Stone. And they'd show up at events where the hard left would be vigorously protesting. So bottom line is they've been involved with criminality, including just within the last week, where one has been charged in the Pacific Northwest on both coasts. You know, yes, they're ideological, but I would also say, and just bear with me, that they're also fraternal. And a lot of the chapters tend to mimic whatever the chapter leader kind of does. And they have, you know, the weird thing about, you know, punching new recruits until they can name, you know, the cereals they like and stuff like that. So there's a fraternal, misogynistic part of this. And some of the bigotry, the anti-Muslim, the xenophobia, let me tell you something. It doesn't sound significantly different from what's been expressed by folks like Stephen Miller in the administration. So when you say, like, what about this group, the Proud Boys? The problem is, and I'll close up this question on this, but it's important. And by the way, we are nonpartisan, okay? But when President Bush spoke 6 days after 9/11 about tolerance towards Muslims, hate crimes against Muslims dropped precipitously the next day and into the next year. And what we've been seeing, whether it's around terror attacks or Charlottesville or elections, we're seeing these increases in both hate crimes, hate speech online, although it's variable, obviously, and these plots or attacks. And now we're entering a season where, you know, elections are the boogeyman. In other words, before it was actual groups, violent Latinos in caravans and Muslims and things like that, which is so interesting because, like, you know what, today, like, they're the frontline workers in the health system. You know, I mean, anyway, we won't go there. But the bottom line is, and this is something we've seen with regard to hate crimes overall, they've been getting more violent. With regard to the terrorist attack overlays, 2019 is going to be the worst year for domestic terrorist violence that we've seen in some time. The DHS report, which kind of came out yesterday, you didn't see a lot of fanfare about it, did you? I was one of the people who was like handing it out like popcorn at an open theater. And what it showed was their verbiage was almost exactly the same as our reports from last year, the year before, and the year before that. So when the president sends a message to the Proud Boys, stand down, he's acknowledging that, hey, I'm kind of your leader. And what the hard fringe movement did not have prior was someone who was a transmitter, a leader, and a coalescer in mainstream politics, who was telegenic and had access across all media. And whatever you want to say about the president, he's a master of using the theater of television and the internet and the news cycle to get his message out. And what he's been doing has been saying that the hard left has been the big threat. And we've been seeing that go through a Martinizing process, right? Or some kind of, you know, processing into American political cheese food, right? That comes out that says the hard left threat is much greater than what we're saying, other analysts are saying, and indeed the agencies themselves, law enforcement and intelligence within the government, are saying as well. And so what we believe, and I'm sorry to have to do this, is we believe that there's been a corruption of the intelligence cycle for politics. And that is the stuff coming out of the law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies is exactly in line what we're seeing. But when we have certain agencies and agency heads saying things, and I am excluding the FBI director, who's been marvelous, it creates a social construction of a boogeyman threat that plays on fears, which may be very effective for getting up one's base, but it also sends a message to groups like the Proud Boys. But also, here's the thing. The Proud Boys are, I don't say the least of my worries. We're concerned about them, but we're concerned about another thing that we've been picking up, other analysts and government agencies have been picking up, and that is the decentralization of extremism, as well as the intertwining and idiosyncratic aspects. So you'll see more like Timothy McVeigh's than Grand Wizards from the Klan. And that's what we're worried about. When he sends this message out, this is a problem, because it might not just galvanize a base, and much of that base will know what to dismiss, right? They'll be like, yeah, these Antifa raccoons with grenades aren't coming to my door. Plane loads of Antifa aren't coming to my house. But I don't like the way change is occurring. And I think one of the things that we have to look at is there's a broad spectrum of people. A lot of these people are looking for purpose and meaning and believe that the institutions that they grew up with have left them behind as society changes. But when that becomes radicalized in an echo chamber online and then amplified by InfoWars or even by presidential tweets, it's a problem, because there's a sliver of people who are unstable or angry who will respond to these stereotypes and conspiracy theories in an aggressive way. Last thing, people formulate attitudes cognitively, their experiences, but also what they read, but also their emotions around them. And then lastly, their behaviors, which manifest the previous two. And what I'm saying to you is there's a spectrum of people on the right, and on the hard right, I'm not talking about conservative people of goodwill. Many of them will take this as just an ability to vent. And they also realize that the president, at the very least, engages in puffery, at the worst, downright falsehoods. But the problem is we can't sift through a grader and take out the dangerous people and the dangerous groups, some of which are informal, some of which are underground. And I think where we are now are yes, Proud Boys, Civil Guard, and that vigilantism. But we're also concerned about a variety of threads on that fringe where loners and small cells can take a ladle to this idiosyncratic 24/7 buffet of fringe conspiracies, stereotypes, and beliefs and formulate their own. But when you're having messages sent out to Proud Boys, and when you're having messages sent out about watch at elections, you are going to have people who are going to respond to that aggressively, either formally in some way, like a civil guard, but also informally from people who we don't know what their names are. They're stealth, they're underground, they're more violent, and they have a shorter half-life. Groups like the Base and Atomwaffen Division, and even smaller associations.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're speaking with Brian Levin, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Coming up next, why politicians need to do more to confront the threat of extremist violence. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're a rich Republican who's been in the U.S. House so long and done so little that you're essentially seen as a piece of congressional furniture, what do you do when faced back home with a popular, well-organized grassroots opponent who's about to overtake you? How about unleashing your inner racist to assail your challenger as a demonic civil liberties zealot who will let hordes of black, Latino, and other criminal elements rampage through white neighborhoods? Endangered Republican incumbents across the country are resorting to this shameful Jim Crow political tactic in a panicky effort to deflect attention from their own do-nothing records. Take longtime Texas Congressman Michael McCaul, who's used to strolling to victory. But oops, in September, with only weeks to go in his re-election race, he found himself in a dead heat with Democrat Mike Siegel, a former school teacher with a progressive populist program of Medicare for all, worker and environmental protections, human rights over corporate greed, etc. Siegel has forged a surging and enthusiastic movement for change. So here comes McCaul with a last-minute down-and-dirty $1 million TV blitz, howling that Siegel is a crazed criminal justice radical who'll shut down the police and empty the prisons. McCaul himself doesn't appear in this ludicrous dog whistle piece of racist fabrication. Instead, he's put up a white Republican constable wearing his official uniform on camera to do the dirty work. The partisan constable cartoonishly tries to gin up voter fear. "Take it from me," he dramatically intones, "Mike Siegel is a threat to your family." This is Jim Hightower saying, problem is, McCaul's gun-toting goofball of a frontman is a notorious right-wing race baiter. But he's just the dummy. McCaul is the despicable ventriloquist, mouthing fear and hate in a pathetic attempt to save his worthless political hide.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're speaking with Brian Levin, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. And we turn the conversation now to how to confront hate and extremism. Brian, starting with our political leaders, what should we be hearing from them?
We should, and by the way, thank you so much for asking this. And again, we're nonpartisan, but we've seen it. Look at John McCain's speech, his concession speech on the evening that Barack Obama was elected. Look at President Reagan, who launched his campaign, by the way, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, when the Klan endorsed him, and without delay dismissed that support, root and branch. We need political leaders, celebrities, and those who have access to a wide pipeline of coverage to talk in a conciliatory manner and say, we can disagree. We don't have that, and it's being rewarded. So that's one thing. Political and cultural leaders set a tone that is picked up by many, whether it's wearing masks or other things. And when we have a president who is retweeting white genocide TM tweets, which say that blacks are responsible for the overwhelming majority of white homicides, that's not helpful. Neither is retweeting Klan-type black crime visuals showing whites being beaten by blacks. I mean, it's elemental. What else do we have to do? Social media companies have to have standards and start enforcing them. And where I think a mistake is being made, Facebook just took down QAnon. And let me tell you, research has shown, we've seen that out of some universities in Canada, for instance, deplatforming extremists off commercial sites, the big ones, actually does have an effect. And we've seen this year the Liberate movement translate into something different, not only a place where people could have both legitimate and sometimes crazy grievances regarding lockdowns, it also became a gathering place and a reservoir for a variety of folks who then went off on their own and radicalized new people. So these large companies are acting, they are doing things. I'm going to say they're not, but after all the horses left the stable, QAnon's huge. We have about 24 congressional candidates this year with QAnon. So social media companies, what else? I think that we want to reward those news media outlets, those interviewers who are effective at promoting civil critical analysis, as you're doing today. It's a cultural thing too. And I think, though, we have to be responsive to people on different ends of the political spectrum who see a changing society and say, you know what? There are values that we all can agree on. Civil discourse, proper elections where everyone can vote, the right to freedom of speech, and the right to peaceful associations in public. Let's start there. But unfortunately, the currency that's given to people is not to folks like Brian and Jim, but for the Anns and InfoWars of the world.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about law enforcement? Should law enforcement be more active in uncovering and disrupting hate groups?
Yes, to the extent that it does not violate First Amendment protections. I'm extremely worried right now when we're seeing federal law enforcement being used for improper purposes, both to stop legitimate peaceful protests, but also where we've seen certain law enforcement agencies, I'm leaving out FBI, have their leaders taking political positions with regard to national security threats. So yes, look, we have to go wherever the most violent threats are. And, whether it's the Jewish Defense League, whether it's the Weather Underground from decades past, or whether it's violent Salafist jihadists from overseas, whether it's hard leftists, whether it's an idiosyncratic mix. But I'll tell you, the biggest threat right now, and I'll tell you something else. I'd love to see the people who years ago were patting me on the back saying, attaboy, when we said, the violent Salafist jihadist threat due to the command of both geography and the internet of some of these groups was having an effect here in the United States. It was used by every xenophobe and Islamophobe as an excuse to defame good Muslim Americans here in the United States. But today, when it's white supremacy, the president says, no, I don't think, when I wrote my piece in Time, I quoted him. He said, no, I don't, it's just a few people, nothing to worry about. So I think law enforcement has to go with where the threat is. We are going to try here in California to start a commission on the state of hate. We have some wonderful assembly people helping us there. But what's happened is the federal government has abrogated its responsibilities, not only with regard to the rhetoric. Hate crime prosecutions were down 38% when I went to the Justice Department last fall, over the last couple of years before that. So what we have to do is make sure that we protect civil liberties, but that we also have an approach that looks at criminality and not politics. And if there's a violent or criminal threat, that should determine where we put our resources, our legislation, and our policies. And I'm concerned in this environment when the quote Antifa threat is being so blown out of proportion as to be a lie, And by the way, can I call somebody out on it? Lara
Sure.
Logan from Fox Nation. She falsely says that the shooting in Ohio last August, was Antifa, when the FBI specifically this summer again came out with a statement saying that there were a multitude of variables with his motivation and that he was a violent problem going back, is what the investigators have been saying as well. So there's been this construction of a threat, and she is unfortunately aiding and abetting that falsehood with respect to Ohio. Bottom line, though, we're seeing a diversification with regard to extremism, and what we need are leaders who will say, even to the folks they disagree with, you should be heard as well. Remember, a lot of people join these movements for personal idiosyncratic reasons. There's peer validation. It feels culturally comfortable at a time of change where no one is saying that I'm important, my safety is important, and my narrative is important. And one of the things I think, frankly, that universities and even our friends who are progressives is say, you know what, maybe we should dialogue more with people of goodwill across the aisle. That's going to be difficult. I wouldn't bet money on that horse coming in first, but I think it's something that we could use. And if you listen to the language, for instance, of President Obama, President Kennedy, even President Bush, and John McCain, there's that tradition that we have to appeal to our better angels. And one of the things that I love about my friends who are progressives is they do like to talk and they like to convince. And I think there is a narrative there from which to build across the aisle, particularly at this time of change. What I'm worried about is an insurgency of those who think they're left out, particularly on the hard right, but not exclusively, who are going to view if the president loses or if some conservative candidates lose, look at that as something where now they have to take arms. This is the kind of violent rhetoric we are seeing on the internet now. So what I'm saying to you is mainstream politics has an effect on extremists. Can they galvanize? Are they part of an insurgency? Is there a shiny object that people can unite on that side of the spectrum, an enemy? It might be Joe Biden, for instance. That's going to be a problem. And that's going to take us even after the election. So my caution now is, unlike past elections where we saw violence kind of be seasonal, sometimes if it looked like, for instance, President Obama was going to get the nomination for both his party and the presidency, hate crimes went up in anticipation. And indeed, he got his Secret Service protection the earliest of any major candidate. So what I'm worried about, though, is the seasonality predictability is going to be changed, and we're going to see something a bit more sustained, because that ecosystem on the hard right fringes is still going to be there. And that's what we worry about, particularly with these folks who want to commit mass killings. We're certainly looking at the civil guard types, the vigilante types, the people who show up to ram cars or shoot at protests. But we're also concerned about this template of young people who leave manifestos and they do it around change. And we have a big possible change coming up. So that's what we look at in the kind of non-ideological way that we run risk assessment.
Brian Levin, criminal justice professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, a nonpartisan group at California State University, San Bernardino, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Brian, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. And irrespective of what your ideology or party is, please vote.
Absolutely. Excellent advice. Thank you again. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Larry Sabato, founder of Sabato's Crystal Ball, tells Bill Press what he expects out of this unprecedented campaign season.
Let's look first at the presidential level. What do you see the state of the race today? And I guess we have to add, have the events of the last week, which are pretty significant, changed the direction of the race in any way that you can see?
All right. As to the first question, you'd much rather be Joe Biden than Donald Trump right now. Of course, we all remember 2016. At every point in the campaign until Jim Comey did his thing 10 or 11 days prior to the election, you would rather have been Hillary Clinton. So with 29 plus days to go, anything can happen and it can turn it around. But Biden is listed as +8 approximately in the polling averages. Some have it a little higher, some have it a little lower, but that's a healthy lead except for one thing. I've just gone through all the state results, and it won't surprise people that California and Oregon and deeply blue states are even bigger blowouts than they were in 2016. Now that sounds like good news, except it isn't. It's going to build up the popular vote plurality for Joe Biden, but it means nothing in terms of the Electoral College. And Trump still has narrow leads, not in every one of the key states, but a lot of them. So there's a fundamental problem. It's called the Electoral College. But we're stuck with it. With it.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I checked again this morning. 2016, Donald Trump, 306 electoral votes, Hillary Clinton, 227. So to get to that magic 270, Joe Biden needs everything Hillary got plus 54, right? Let's say to get to 271. Where does he get them?
Well, you start with Pennsylvania and Michigan. If he can't carry those two, we know right away Donald Trump has got a second term. Wisconsin, the polls have been great. They've been better than they were in 2016 by far. But people on the ground there don't give you the same story. They still think it's close. Now, do you go with their gut reactions and their gut evaluation? Do you go with the polls? I always split the difference, Bill, because that's the kind of guy I am.
Right. How about Florida? How about New Hampshire, Ohio?
If we see on election night that Florida is going to Biden, we know it's over. And Florida reports everything relatively quickly. By relatively, I mean after their 2000 experience, Bush Gore, they got it together, more or less. And so in the wee hours, we'll know Florida. There's no way Trump will win without Florida. No, I keep getting these emails with these strange maps, how he wins without Florida. Please spare me. So that one, I kind of think in the end will go to Trump. But if this ends up being a strong drift, a strong wave in the Democratic direction, then Biden will carry Florida.
And New Hampshire, Ohio?
Oh, New Hampshire, I think, is solidly Democratic. This is not like 2016, which, after all, still went to Hillary Clinton, but barely. This is a different situation. They have really been turned off by Donald Trump. It shows up in 100 ways.
Mm-hmm. And, they always say Republican cannot win without winning Ohio. I was surprised to see one poll, at least recently, that showed Joe Biden with a very narrow lead in Ohio. Not that I believe it, but how do you read it?
I'm with you, Bill. I don't believe it. Right now, the polling average has it as dead even. To me, that means Trump's going to win it. Mm-hmm. But you would expect that. And the real thing to look for is margin. He won Ohio and Iowa in near landslides. I mean, it was very close to the 55 mark, if not a little over. Well, that tells you something right there. If he's at 50-50, or even if he wins 52-48, it means he's lost ground. And it really matters in the states that were close in 2016.
Right. So what do you think the chances are that we will know the evening of November 3rd who the next president is?
I spend entirely too many hours every single day going through the historical maps and looking at all the entrails of the massive number of polls which are being taken because of the failures in 2016. I'm all for it. But here's what I've learned, I think. Because of our polarization and tribal politics, the maximum that Biden can get, his ceiling, is really Obama's 2008, almost 53%. That's his ceiling. Now his floor is Hillary's 48. So we're operating within a narrow range. If he is closer to his ceiling, I think we'll know sometime on November 4th. Can't give you the hour, but I think we'll have a very strong indication of what's going on. If this turns out to be close, that is within, say, 25 to 30 electoral votes, then it's going to be a while. And God help us, because that means it'll go through the courts. And, if Trump gets that third appointment through with a 6-3 majority, I think you can pretty much count on the Supreme Court deciding the legal issues in Trump's favor. It's funny how that works out.
It is funny how that works out, isn't it? And of course, it seems from his comments that that's what he wants, right? God.
One thing you can say about Trump that's actually helpful to analysts, while his White House is anything but transparent, he is completely transparent. He can't keep anything to himself. He talks so much and tweets so much that sooner or later you're going to learn exactly what his mind is thinking.
Now, the polls can change, as you pointed out in your answer to our very first question. I want to ask you about some of the events of this past week, and if you think they have or have the potential to change the direction. Let's start with the fact that the President of the United States has COVID. And at this point, he's in Walter Reed. He'll probably be out by the time this podcast is heard, but he still has COVID, which takes him out of campaign action, at least for a few days.
For a few days. Look, if he's willing to infect his Secret Service agents and aides in that presidential SUV, as he did on Sunday evening at Walter Reed, he's willing to go on all kinds of trips for rallies and everything else, whether he's fully well or not. You know it, I know it. There's a selfishness there that is at his core that has been obvious since he came on the scene. Probably before he came on the scene. So look, is it hurting him? Not with his base, and probably not with people who were planning on voting for him, assuming he makes a recovery. It doesn't have to be super quick, but as long as it's before Election Day, I don't think it'll hurt him. But I also don't think it will help him in the way it would help, say, another president who didn't generate such strong feelings and didn't promote such intense polarization. Nobody's going to change sides, Bill. You know that. People are dug in. They're in their foxholes. They're not going to crawl across the DMZ and move to the other person because they hear the general on the other side is sick.
So you think it's locked in already?
I think pretty much it's locked in. The question that will determine the election is, what's the excitement level on the Trump side versus the excitement level on the Biden side? And remember, the excitement level on the Biden side is determined more by hatred of Trump. That's fine. Right. A vote is a vote is a vote is a vote, whether it's generated by love or hate or like or dislike. I think it's locked in, but we always have the problem of figuring out who is really going to turn out.
Yeah. Now, one impact about COVID I want to ask you about, and that is clearly this is the last thing Donald Trump wanted to be talking about, right? I mean, he's tried to change the subject to law and order, to Hunter Biden, to mail-in ballots or whatever, right? Anything but COVID-19. Right. Doesn't the fact that he now is a part of the 7.5 million Americans who've caught the disease, doesn't that mean that COVID's back as number one, is going to stay as number one?
I would think so. You never know if it's going to last 29 days or, it's going to last
24 hours.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the craziest year except for 1968 in terms of elections in my lifetime anyway. Of course, you go way back, Bill. You go way. I mean, you were there when Herbert Hoover lost. But anyway, I'm kidding.
What a night.
I was born under Truman, so I'm not far behind you. Anyway, the point is that this is a campaign that is really more predictable than most in some ways, but also less predictable in other ways. It's more predictable because everybody's dug in. It's less predictable because if there ever was a cursed year, it's 2020, and we've had all these black swan events. What makes us think there are no more black swans, that they could land in the lake at any moment?
Yep. Well, speaking of black swans, were it not for the COVID diagnosis, you and I would be talking about the fallout from Tuesday night's debate. Did Donald Trump expand his base at all or reach out or bring anybody in from his debate performance?
Absolutely not. I think he actually lost a few. Look, even the ones sticking with him saying, reluctantly vote for him, well, that's lower enthusiasm. And they were turned off massively by his attitude. And the surveys so far have shown that 2-1 or sometimes better. People say Donald Trump showed he doesn't have the temperament to be president. And Biden did, more or less. And again, it doesn't matter as much what Biden showed. What matters is the president of the United States was an ass, historically an ass on that debate stage. It was an embarrassment. And I've talked to people, a lot of journalists and friends who live abroad, and the image of the United States, which was already low thanks to Donald Trump, is down below the basement. Particularly
hurt him with women?
Yes. Although, I'm a man. And I was repulsed by it. We tend to emphasize these categories too much. But yeah, particularly women. And that's his giant problem along with senior citizens.
Right. You mentioned that certainly if Amy Coney Barrett is on the Supreme Court, she will have maybe a lasting impact on this election. But short of that, both Republicans and Democrats make the case that this nomination battle is going to energize their base. Who do you think it helps?
This time, I think it's a wash, and it hasn't been for the most recent ones. It has helped Republicans substantially because they seem to care consistently more about court appointments than they do a lot of other issues, and Democrats don't. They should, but they don't. My students should study more, but they don't. What are you going to do about it?
Well, get out and vote, I think, is what people are hoping people will do. But and finally, on the issues, before I want to ask you about a couple of Senate races before we let you go. Does anybody, you pay your taxes, I'm sure. I pay my taxes. Yes. Donald Trump doesn't. Does anybody care?
Again, they ought to. I'm stunned that people don't care more about this. Of course, tax returns should always be released before an election, particularly the first election. So he's been an incumbent for 4 years, so people say it's a little late to be worried about that. I've heard people say that. No, it isn't. But go back to 2016. He got away with murder. Meanwhile, we were fascinated by Hillary Clinton's emails. I mean, think about that. And it really tells us the failure in 2016 of the press and a lot of other, not you, not Bill Press, but the news media. Maybe you too. I don't know. But it's a failure of our system that he got away with this.
Bill Press with Larry Sabato, founder and director of the University of Virginia Center for Politics and Sabato's Crystal Ball. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Brian Levin and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.